But the Ikhwan is more than a fighting force. The Ikhwan is also part of a larger strategy of Ibn Saud's to pacify, we might say civilize, the Bedouin or the nomads. Abdulaziz ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Faisal Al Saud was born in the late 19th century here in Riyadh. But he was born during a time of declining power for the House of Saud. In fact, when he was still a kid, his family was expelled by the new power in town, the House of Rashid, the Rashidis. And so Abdulaziz Ibn Abdul Rahman Ibn Faisal Al Saud, who the world will come to know as Ibn Saud, particularly the Western world, so we're going to call him that, Ibn Saud. As a kid, expelled from Riyadh, his family bounces around in exile, bounces around from, living in the desert with the Bedouin for a while, living in Qatar, living in Bahrain for a while, and finally setting up a sort of government, or at least house in exile, in Kuwait. And these are the places where Ibn Saud grew to manhood, despite the mutterings perhaps of his father, Abdul Rahman, strict Wahhabi, about the immorality of the people in places like Kuwait. Well, by the turn of the 20th century, both sides are trading strikes on the other. The Rashidis have their eyes on Kuwait and are raiding into Kuwaiti territory. The Saudis with the Kuwaitis, it's the Kuwaitis, I should say, with the Saudis, raiding into Rashidi-controlled territory. And Ibn Saud in 1901, he's leading his own raiders into Rashidi territory. And it gets bad enough and it gets dangerous enough that the Rashidis call on the Ottomans in Iraq, the Ottoman governor in Baghdad, to come help. And at this point, Abdul Rahman, he orders his son Ibn Saud to come back to Kuwait. Now that's how dangerous it is. But Ibn Saud, he has his eyes on Riyadh. He wants to reconquer the old capital. So he disobeys his father's orders and he stays through the end of the year and into 1902. And that year, he and about 40 guys creep into Riyadh at night. They down a bunch of palm trees and climb over the walls and are able to surprise the garrison at Masmak Fortress and kill the governor there and take Riyadh, take the city, 1902. And I should note a couple things here. If it seems like the Rashidis fell, or at least the Rashidis in Riyadh fell quickly, well, part of the reason for that is that the Rashidis are not popular in Riyadh at all. They've done very little to ingratiate themselves to the local population. I mean, they impose high taxes, they're very harsh in their rule, they continue to plunder, even areas that they control, they're plundering villages and whatnot. They're largely seen as Ottoman puppets. And just before Ibn Saud takes Riyadh, the Rashidis had carried out a massacre of citizens that had been seen as Saudi supporters. So very little love lost between the Riyadhis and those who lived around Riyadh and the Rashidis. And I should point out too that this episode of the taking of Masmak Fortress by Ibn Saud, this is huge as a founding episode today in the national story of Saudi Arabia. It's become almost mythologized, as such stories often are by central governments. So in Saudi textbooks and in museums, you'll see this story celebrated in glowing terms. In fact, Masmak Fortress itself has been entirely turned into a museum dedicated to celebrating the story of the taking of Riyadh by Ibn Saud in 1902. Well, it took the House of Saud several years, 2 to 3 years, to consolidate power even in the central Nejd. But eventually these tribes are pacified and these oasis towns are subdued. And everywhere that Ibn Saud conquers, of course, he sends in Wahhabi scholars. So the soldiers are first, physically subdue the place, and then the scholars come in and they're installed as religious judges. They're there as scholars to enforce the Wahhabi system and everything that doesn't jive with the Wahhabi system, including, tombs that are visited, saints' tombs that are visited, pilgrims looking for miracles or to pray to the saints' shrines and other things, these are all leveled, otherwise destroyed, as the Wahhabi system is enforced, first by the soldiers, then by the clerics. Well, the Rashidis, the reeling Rashidis, combined forces with the Ottomans, and almost 5,000 Turks are sent into the Nejd to fight the Saudis, but the bid fails. By 1906, the combined Rashidis Ottomans have been defeated by the Saudis, and in fact, of the 4,500 or so Turks that are sent into the Nejd to fight the Saudis, only about 1,000 make it out alive. And by 1912, the Saudis, centered at Riyadh, are dominant in the Nejd. Well, 1912 is also the year that Ibn Saud institutes one of his great innovations. Well, great at first, maybe very troublesome in the end, you be the judge. And that innovation is the creation of a religious militia, the Ikhwan, a religious militia called the Ikhwan. And with the Ikhwan, supplementing his regular conscript army, he's able by 1913 to conquer virtually the entire eastern province, so much of eastern Arabia. But the Ikhwan is more than a fighting force. The Ikhwan is also part of a larger strategy of Ibn Saud's to pacify, we might say civilize, the Bedouin or the nomads. He wants them settled, and he establishes something like 200 farm colonies. Okay, and he invites the Bedouin to settle on the farm colonies, and he incentivizes that settlement by offering them freebies, free tools, free land, other free things. And he's largely successful in getting huge numbers of Bedouin to at least try out these farm colonies, and all males of fighting age are then roped in to the Ikhwan, where they are propagandized to by Wahhabi scholars who essentially turn the Ikhwan into an army, we might say, of zealots. Okay, so not just a supplement to the army, often the tip of the Saudi spear, but also an army of zealots, the enforcement arm of the Wahhabi system. Well, Ibn Saud now issues a ban on raiding across his domains. From now on, if you want to raid, you have to wait for an official call to jihad by the Saudi state. So official jihad now takes the place of raids. And the idea is that these farm colonies are going to be productive enough that the need for raiding will be gone anyway. And that the only time we'll need to raid is jihad, when the Saudi state, needs you. And so that's the idea, but unfortunately the farm colonies aren't super successful, they're not super productive, and limited raiding continues despite the ban. Well, during the World War I years, Ibn Saud is able to maneuver the British into providing him with military protection and recognition, guns, ammo, other freebies. In exchange, he promises the British he's going to make life miserable for the Ottomans. And Ibn Saud might have even become Britain's man among the Arabs. So the British are looking for an Arab to lead a revolt against the Ottomans. They're hoping to foment rebellion, obviously, within the Ottoman Empire against the Turks. And so they're looking for an Arab to lead that revolt. And they promise, they're willing to promise at least they act like they're willing to promise a post-war pan-Arab state led by this man, this Arab. And the British political agent that is in the Saudi court, surnamed Shakespeare, he apparently was very, very impressed by Ibn Saud. It's not unlikely Ibn Saud would have been the guy. But Shakespeare died during a raid in 1915, and dying with him was any chance, really, that Ibn Saud would be chosen. And instead, the British turned to the Sharif of Mecca. Now, the Sharifs of Mecca, the House of Saud, lots of bad blood going back at least a century. And in fact, before World War I was even over, 1917, the Sharif's forces from the Hejaz and Saudi forces from the Nejd are already clashing. They're already fighting with each other in the first Saudi-Hashemite war. Well, there was a truce in 1919, temporarily bringing a halt to the fighting, but violence flared up again shortly thereafter in the second Hashemite Saudi war. In 1924, Ibn Saud ordered the Ikhwan to Taif, to the Hijazi city of Taif, to use it as a staging ground from which to conquer the holy cities. Well, as the Ikhwan approached Taif, the defenders of the city, led by Ali, the son of the Sharif, just left. They fled. And the Ikhwan were able to run into the city and pillage and unfortunately massacre hundreds of inhabitants of Taif. In fact, the number might be 1,000. The Taif massacre, the massacre of Taif. Well, over the next few months, Mecca was taken, Medina was taken. This, by the way, represents the end of a 700-year reign, or at least administrative reign, by the Sharifs of Mecca. Over. Now it's the House of Saud that is dominant in the holy cities. And then after a year-long siege, Jeddah falls to the Saudis, the great port through which pilgrims had traditionally accessed the holy cities. Ibn Saud was lord not just of the Nejd, but also of the Hejaz. And he immediately set about establishing police authority throughout the Hejaz. And when I say police authority, I don't just mean police the way we in the West think of it, but also religious police, enforcing the Wahhabi system. Well, after the conquest of the Hejaz and the declaration of not just the kingdom of the Hejaz, but 1927, the kingdom of the Nejd, Ibn Saud spends the next couple years finishing the pacification of the interior of Arabia. Arabia is huge, okay? It's massive. If you were to superimpose it on a map of Europe, you might be surprised how big the Arabian Peninsula is. And so there are still little pockets of resistance to Saudi rule. So he's busy taking care of that. And units of the Ikhwan are raiding outside, even outside of Saudi-controlled territory. They're raiding into Kuwait. They're raiding into Transjordan. They're raiding into Iraq. The British have a problem with this. So this could be a problem. Ibn Saud wants to nip it in the bud, and so he bans further raiding. In particular, there's an incident with the British, a little back and forth between the Ikhwan and the British. And the Ikhwan would like to go on the warpath and take the offensive. Ibn Saud not so keen on that. And so he bans raiding. Well, the Ikhwan doesn't like this. There's been tension building up between the Ikhwan and Ibn Saud for some time. The Ikhwan do not like that Ibn Saud has dealings with the British at all, the unbelieving British. Many of them also oppose Ibn Saud's introduction after his conquest of the Hejaz of new technologies, automobiles, airplanes, telephones, telephone and telegraph lines. I mean, these are technologies that did not exist in Muhammad's day, therefore they should not be used. In fact, some units of the Ikhwan will actually sabotage Ibn Saud's own telephone lines, own communication lines and infrastructure. So that's interesting. Ibn Saud himself will apparently retort, well, your rifles weren't around during Muhammad's day. Are you going to give those up? Of course, the Ikhwan don't give those up. The Ikhwan have also been building up sort of a resentment with the townsfolk, particularly settled folk on the peninsula. The Ikhwan, of course, mostly made up of nomads or former nomads. And they'll go into these towns and they will enforce the Wahhabi system. And again, this could be characterized as an army of zealots. So they're enforcing things like, no smoking, no music, no dancing, they're enforcing mandatory prayer, they're enforcing mandatory mosque attendance. And this irks a lot of people. And you wonder when you read about this, are we dealing here with just religious zealotry? Is that it? Or are we dealing with a manifestation of an age-old animosity between the Bedouin, the nomads, and the oasis dwellers, the townsfolk, okay, using the vehicle of Wahhabism? And you be the judge. But in any case, it's rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. This tension has been growing for some time, and with Ibn Saud's ban on raiding, there is a revolt, the Ikhwan revolt. And in 1928, when Ibn Saud tries to gather the leadership of the Ikhwan together in Riyadh to work out their problems, the leadership of the Ikhwan don't even show up. In fact, there's evidence that the three main leaders of the Ikhwan had ambitions, each to rule a different province, the eastern province, the Nejd and the Hejaz, to essentially depose Ibn Saud and rule these provinces, one each. In any case, lots of different things happening here, probably a lot of different dynamics going on, but we have an Ikhwan revolt, and it lasts for a couple years before it's finally put down by the regular Saudi army by 1930. And surviving Ikhwan units are then incorporated into the regular army. Well, by 1932, Ibn Saud decides he's going to unite the two kingdoms, the kingdom of the Nejd and the kingdom of Hejaz, into one united kingdom. Its capital will be at Riyadh, and its name will be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The next year, 1933, Ibn Saud grants a concession to an American oil company called SoCal. That concession is going to change everything, but that's another story.